Hey everyone, Mr. Weinland here, and just want to go over the history of science films, science fiction films with you guys. You can fill out the questions on the Google form, or if you have the packet, you need to email me your answers. While you're watching this video, you might want to just go ahead and copy down these answers, and then write them down, then enter them in the Google Forms. But the idea of what we're going to be talking about in this little presentation that I've put together is we're really going to get into the history of science fiction. Why is it important? Why is this such a valued themed genre? A lot of people don't give science fiction the credit it deserves. I think you're seeing science fiction finally getting recognized more and more by the Oscars. It seems like every decade, but it still feels like it's a struggle. Like the Academy has been more accepting of science fiction films that still meet the dramas type standard, but and can the average audience can kind of grasp around, but also have this intellectual aspect or value to it. I do think it's changing. It's getting a little bit better each year, but it's still a struggle for science fiction to even get nominated for Oscars. But we're going to talk about these questions. We're going to talk about the silent film era. We're going to talk about the 1930s. We're going to talk about the 50s, 60s, the 80s, the 90s until now. But you want to make sure you kind of write these questions down, and we'll go over them and write your answers. If you want to pause here to write them down, do that right now. All right, and after you've written them down, then you can pause and answer the questions. So let's talk about this. Let's go all the way back to science fiction in the silent film era. I would say that science fiction played a lot better in the silent film era, because during that time you really needed to be creative, and it was a new technology um, with the camera, which we talked about. The camera played a big part in understanding how's it work, what aspects can you do. The thing is you were limited on, obviously you couldn't talk, you had to use cue cards for dialogue. You're also limited on your minutes, and so you had to come up with a quick, fun, engaging story. And a lot of times drama didn't always fit that. Plus, it was black and white, so it made it a little bit more difficult for even sci-fi as well. You could do color tinting, which we talked about, also painting the films. So obviously, but it was going to be difficult either way, whether what direction you went. But the good thing is that the science fiction films made it a little bit easier to go with is your story, because you needed to quickly get people in and going, get the story moving, and science fiction was the best way to do that. Whereas drama, you have to build and slowly build the story, which we saw with The Kid versus Le Voyage, or Le Voyage dans la Lune, or A Trip to the Moon, which we watched with George Méliès. George Méliès knew how to grasp the audience, get them involved, and I would say the silent film era was a good era. And we saw a little bit of that into the 1920s, but really what you started to see happen is that with sound and dialogue being added into the movies, it did open up a little bit more. Impacted the story a little bit more, and it was able to allow certain dramas, to kind of build in and do some character development, and not have to worry about so much trying to come up with this big, massive scale of creativity. So we also start to see more escapist themes during this time. A little bit more serious speculative films were starting to be more on the decline, and so we start to see that this idea of trying to come up with these big, massive sci-fi films, just something that not a lot of people wanted, especially after a big budget in 1930 with the film Just Imagine. It did not do very well. it ultimately caused some studios to be very careful about what they spent their money on and not trying to do these big massive productions, especially when you started to see certain films. What we saw with detective films, film noir was popular. The thriller films were starting to come out in the late 30s into the 40s. And so those types of films were getting a little bit more of a push, film noir, instead of things like science fiction. So that definitely pushed a little bit more closer to the low budget, and kind of putting those, certain heroic adventure actions into more shorts, and kind of getting away from futuristic. And so we started to see that happening in science fiction films. But we still see that, as I pull back on this one, we see that a lot of the science fiction um, films and the theme industry owes a lot of this to the Cold War, or what we see is the nuclear war, or the fears of apocalyptic worlds. That really opened the door up for sci-fi um, because what ended up happening during that time period with the Cold War is you had created an us versus them type of mentality. And so a lot of filmmakers were very careful of trying to not um, poke fun or be critical of the propaganda of the United States because you remember, the Cold War, and what also had happened is it caused a lot of what was called the blacklist because of McCarthyism, trying to figure out who's a communist, who's not a communist. So a lot of filmmakers were put on the blacklist, and this fear of the government really jeopardized and really hurt some filmmakers to attack certain political issues. So, and like we said, that certain filmmakers had to get creative in addressing these issues with our government during the time of the Red Scare, the fear of communism. So what did you see? Remember, we watched the CNN the movies in the 1960s, especially late 50s, 1960s. What did they do? They incorporated these themes that we're dealing with the Cold War and the Red Scare and communism and McCarthyism, and they put it in like themed movies, like certain cowboy and western films, especially the western films. There was a lot of us against them aspects, and then this opened up the door for science fiction to come in, where you started to see the golden age of science fiction, where we're seeing a lot more alien invasion movies, because how better to explain the fear of the Russians coming to America, but then turning them into aliens. And then a lot of filmmakers did is they would flip the script. So obviously, throughout most of the movie, you're thinking, "Oh no, these aliens are bad. They're here to kill us. They're coming after us." And then ultimately, at the end of the movie, guess what ends up happening? Oh, they weren't bad after all. We were the bad guys. And that's kind of what the filmmakers were trying to say. Like, you're creating this fear, United States of America, not so much the Russians. Yes, there is a fear there, but you're creating this mass fear that they're so bad that we have to stockpile on nuclear weapons, and you're causing people to have to be aware that they may be dropping a nuclear bomb on us, and so that definitely got people thinking. And also, the nuclear bomb threat also made things a little bit interesting on how things would happen if things like a nuclear war were to happen. And so, like, example, Destination Moon, we see in the 1950s, it follows a nuclear powered rocket ship carrying 4 men to the moon against a background of competition against the Soviets. The film is set the bar of what to expect within sci-fi film. So you're starting to see this aspect of apocalyptic world, nuclear war. What would that look like? And then also other filmmakers going a much more creative route of figuring out, like, oh, what can we do if the aliens invaded, and kind of using that as a way of, aha, it's the Russians, and that aspect. So that was one way of going about it. We do see things, sci-fi start to go different directions, away from the 50s, and in the 60s, it kind of goes a little bit more out in space. It's still kind of in that some aspects. Cold War inspires it a little bit, because during that time in the '60s, it was the space race. Um, we had competition between the United States and Russia, both sides trying to be the first, take the first man to the moon. The United States won in that little war there. So we do see that led to people like Stanley Kubrick to come up with the 2001 Space Odyssey and really addressing science fiction out in space. What would space look like? What is it like? What would it be like in the future? And so kind of going that route. And then ultimately the dangers of also coming back a little bit, the dangers of space and also the dangers of society and where we are seeing ourselves, as you can see in the science fiction film 1968 Planet of the Apes. Charlton Heston, he's an astronaut who goes into space. He goes in through deep hibernation. They and during that time when they wake up, their spacecraft lands on this mysterious planet, and it's ruled by apes. If you have not seen this movie, it's spoiler alert. I'm sorry, I'm going to ruin it for you. But this whole time, Charlton Heston is, talking, and he's had these. There's these apes who are talking back to him, and he's trying to understand, why am I in a world of apes, like what is going on here? And then eventually when he is allowed to leave the ape society and go on his own, he ends up finding the Statue of Liberty and realizing, I've been on Earth this whole time and I'm in New York City, and somehow years have passed and now the apes have controlled the world and they are the ones talking. So it's that kind of sci-fi, the dangers of nuclear war, the dangers of where our society and science may go. So that definitely pushed some boundaries, and science fiction kind of would go through some weird. Why are you wondering why I don't have the 70s up here? Because the 60s set up the 70s. It was very much the same, of just kind of more political, very political in its base. A lot of political theme. But at that point in time in the 70s, I think a lot of people were getting tired of sci-fi. They didn't like all the different theming and stuff that was being thrown in. Plus, there was too much Planet of the Apes. There was a bunch of sequels, and so I think people were getting kind of tired of sci-fi. It wasn't until 1977 when George Lucas came up with a little flick called Star Wars, and that really blew up the game for everybody in science fiction, because as great as Planet of the Apes was, I think a lot of people were getting kind of tired of it. And also in the 1960s, even though we did have Star Trek and people loved Star Trek, that too was getting a little bit too themed of and political of, because in some ways I like Star Trek, but it is very much we must figure out a way to study other peoples and societies and interact and work together. And at some point, people are like, that's boring. Well, I just want to see an action film. And that's what George Lucas does, is he takes your regular day action films and Greek mythology, but just puts it in space. And ultimately he kind of creates almost like a Western type space movie. And that blows up the game in the 1980s with the sequels of Star Wars. Thanks off of its success, we start to see more and more industries or studios try to go down that sci-fi route. We do see Star Trek is reborn, because it's funny. I was showing my wife the Netflix. It's on right now if you want to watch it. It's the Toys That Made Us. They were talking about Star Trek and about how so many kids were starving for Star Trek toys, because the series only ran for 3 seasons, and it's crazy. They had a cartoon, I think, that ran for a few seasons, but somehow people just caught on to Star Trek and watched the reruns, and just passed it on to the next kid, the next generation, and everybody just caught on to Star Trek. But it wasn't quite Star Wars. But because of the success of Star Wars, even though Star Trek came out in the 60s, the mid 60s, right around then, they rebooted it in the 80s, because because Paramount was like, okay, so 20th Century Fox has Star Wars. Is there anything like that we already own? And they realized, oh, we have Star Trek. So that's what pushed the Star Trek movies, the 6 original Star Trek movies, and then we had the Next Generation films, which Next Generation was Luke Picard, and Captain Kirk was the captain of Star Trek. But then ultimately we have the reboots, the 3 reboot movies, which I love, and they're awesome. But also it wasn't just like, hey, let's let's try to get people in space. There was others like Steven Spielberg who were like, let's bring aliens to Earth, and that's which brought ET, and a little bit more dramatic film about family and what you value, what's important to you, and ET kind of dealing with the fact of what do I do on this planet? How do I interact with these people? And that just the sci-fi just started to regenerate new ideas. And ultimately, what we see in the '80s is that this we were seeing sci-fi not just in one scope. We were starting to open it up a little bit and become a little bit bigger. And that's we see more of a variety of film. Now, in the 1990s, what we start to see sci-fi go is less space because there was a lot of space movies, and I think people were getting after Star Wars was done with Return of the Jedi. I think a lot of people were like, I'm done and done with space. And same with the '80s. I think there was a lot of, too much of that, too much of this. And so what we started to see is that the science fiction genre was going a little bit of a different direction of taking certain aspects of our life and incorporating that into the genre. And the one big thing that was changing in our lives was the World Wide Web, because the World Wide Web, I want to say it came out about late '80s, but really wasn't really used by everybody until the '90s. And so that spawned a lot of different types of movies like The Lawnmower Man, which is not really about a lawnmower guy, the guy who mows lawns. Okay, it's kind of a freaky movie. It's kind of hard to explain, but basically it's about a guy, I believe, who uses the web to kill people and hurt people. And so that basically that's he's embedded into the web. And then same thing with Virtuosity. But definitely what this did was these two movies, it projected the fear of the internet, of like what computers can do to us. And I think you started to see that happening a little bit more and more. Like, even though War Games was popular in the '80s, and kind of was a sci-fi film, but it's also a very political. I don't think a lot of people consider it a complete sci-fi film, but that kind of that idea of what can computers do to us, and that's also kind of also 2001: Space Odyssey with HAL. So the 1990s with the web, World Wide Web, it took some ideas from the past and incorporated it into what we see every day. And especially in 1999, The Matrix, we see that definitely this was a what if machines controlled the world? What if the computers turned on us and eventually we have to use the internet or a version of the internet to get back at the machines? And that's what The Matrix was about, of exploring that idea of the future of the web. How further can we get? Virtual reality. What would virtual reality look like somewhere down the line? And honestly, I could probably see us create a Matrix like virtual reality where we could plug into the back and and then we could have our own little world. That'd be weird and creepy, but honestly, could it happen? Yeah, I could see it happen. But that's kind of where the direction of sci-fi was going, was using technology. Like, where would technology take us, and how could we use it? So now we go into 2000s, the present. We do see that we get a little bit more further away from just space travel movies. We get more into fantasy. Now, Tolkien, he wrote the Lord of the Rings back in the '40s, and I know a lot of people don't necessarily consider Lord of the Rings sci-fi. It's more fantasy, but there are certain sci-fi elements to it, that you can see that they take and incorporate into the movie. We also see the reemergence of old franchises become almost somewhat new again. Star Trek reboots. We see Star Wars with the prequels coming back, and eventually we see the new trilogy coming. So, and then this incorporated the superhero genre, where we start to see the idea of technology, and also just the you know biology and chemistry, how that is affecting people, giving them the superpowers. And like, for example, you look at Black Panther, he's using not just some sort of like super serum to make him strong, but he also using technology like vibranium. So and then you're also seeing with Captain America, Super Soldier, and then even Tony Stark with technology. So we're going a different route with sci-fi, and it's opening the doors for new things. And I'll go back here with even The Matrix. The Matrix changed the game not only just because of storytelling, but also technology. There's a lot of new technology that came out from that movie, and it definitely changed the way we experience films. And that is the one good thing about science fiction that I don't think a lot of people give credit to, is that science fiction is not um, just incorporating technology to tell a story. It's making that storytelling better. And that, like when you watch The Matrix, the fact that they incorporated new technologies into that, especially the scene where Neo is going back like this, and they go all the way, they do that pan around him using that different type of camera system. That really changed the game for film, and I think it just gives directors a some more options and opportunities to take their story somewhere where the audience can understand it better, and B, makes it just a cool film. And so that's the one benefit about science fiction that a lot of people don't talk about, and it doesn't really get its credit. And why more science fiction films, in my opinion, need to be nominated for Oscars is because they take you down different rabbit holes. And yes, they have to use sometimes special effects and certain technologies to do that, but it makes you want to watch the films, especially if it's written well. Now, look, science fiction is a hit and miss. There are some good dramas, there are great dramas, some good dramas, and not very good dramas. Whereas in science fiction, a lot of times it's great or it's not very good. Very rare do you see a middle. So with science fiction, but to me, I think it's one of those that I love and I am very fond of. But again, here are the questions again. You can go back over and get the answers. You go on Google Forms that I have on the Google page for this class to fill out the answers. Number 8, though, you will have to find a sci-fi film if you can go on Netflix or something to get some inspiration. If you want to find a really old film, honestly, I would try to go and see if you can find a film in the 60s or 70s that's science fiction related and see what you can find there. But if you want to go more modern, that's fine. Try to keep it PG-13, please. That'd be best. But again, I'm giving you a little bit more room to explain the film, give me your review of the film, and why did you choose it? Why did you choose to watch it? So again, check it out. Really glad that I'm able to kind of go over these notes with you guys. Hope everything's going good. But if you need to email me at winelandp@manford.k12 .ok.us. All right, that's winelandp@manford.k12.ok.us. See you guys. Good luck.